Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fourth installment of the 2023-2024 Faith and Life Lecture Series. It's good to have you all here. I'm Pastor Tim Westermeyer, Senior Pastor of St. Philip the Deacon here, which is privileged to put these on as a community service, and I want to be sure to welcome both all of you who are in the sanctuary tonight and also all of you who are joining us digitally this evening. Thank you for taking some time out of a busy evening. We're now in our 21st season of this series, and over those 2 decades we have invited all kinds of people to come in and speak with us. We've had artists, we've had musicians, we've had bloggers and authors and nonprofit leaders and business executives. The common theme with all of them is that they're Christian, and so they come to speak a word about what their faith means for them and how they live it out in their life. Tonight's speaker is a little bit out of the mold because most of our speakers are actually not theologians or pastors, they're lay people. I'll say a word about him in a second and how he's different that way, maybe different in some other ways too. Before that, though, I just want to say a word about the flow of the evening, so he will come up and speak for a little bit. After he's done with his sort of formal presentation, there will be a chance for a question and answer session. So if you're here in the sanctuary, I would invite you to come up to a mic to my right or to my left and ask the question that way. If you are joining us digitally tonight, you can either ask a question in the field below the live stream at faithandlife.org, or you can send an email to social@spdlc.org. That's St. Philip Lutheran Church, St. Philip Deacon Lutheran Church.org, spdlc.org. And we'll get those emails or those questions. They'll come to me on my phone up here, and I will ask them during the Q&A session. So I mention that now just so you can be thinking about questions you might want to ask. So tonight's speaker, I mentioned, he is a trained theologian. He was a professor for a time at a couple of schools, including one you may have heard of out east called Yale. He was also a pastor at 3 or 4 different churches, including a sort of peer church of ours here in the neighborhood, was at a community church, which is where I first met him. And it was a delight 8-9 years ago, almost 10 years ago now, to meet you then. And I was sad that you left the area. But he left the area to form a nonprofit called House United, which, as it says in his bio, it works to unite people from differing viewpoints toward a common good, which strikes me as something that we are deeply in need of in our world today. If you've been to one of these events in the past, you'll know that I always like to include some quirky, sort of off the beaten path point about our speakers. So I did ask him earlier today if he had a quirky thing he could share with me. I will tell you, you're the first speaker who's ever done this. Instead of answering the question, he sent a text to his wife. And she wrote back and said, "Where do I begin?" However, he has decided on one quirky fact, which is that he went, and he might want to say more about this when he gets up here, and it sort of suggests his expansive view of the church. He went to a Quaker evangelical college. So he'll unpack that a bit. Will you help join me in welcoming Alan Hilton?
Well, hello. It's great to see you all. And I couldn't come up with something funnier. Right? Liz listed some things that you don't want to hear about, but I couldn't come up with a quirky, funny thing. I will say I was student body president at that school, and the guy before me was a strong, conservative, hawk kind of Reagan guy, and the woman who came right after me was a Birkenstocks peacenik. And so, weird little college, maybe part of where I got the idea that we had to bring difference together. I have a job that I got to make up. I got to invent my job. It happened in around 2012, although I kept my day job for 4 years after that I started to realize, or had been for a while realizing, that the nation was falling apart at the seams, and that the church was falling apart at the seams because we weren't doing very well with disagreement. In 2012, at the church down the street, we noticed when the marriage amendment was up, remember the referendum on the marriage, one man, one woman for life, and people all around the Twin Cities were talking about this, were buzzing about it, and they were buzzing about it with the people they agreed with. So we heard parking lot conversation between people on one side or people on the other side, but they weren't talking to one another. So at the church, we got this brilliant idea. We'll just invite everybody in and say, let's talk about this, even with people who don't agree with us. And lo and behold, 400 of our congregants came on I think it was a Wednesday night, to talk to one another about this amendment. That was the first of what we came to call courageous conversations. And it's when I got the idea that maybe helping even more widely than at that church might be a good thing in the world. So I am charged tonight with putting faith and polarization somehow in play together. The subtitle is one I want to go to, Surviving and Thriving in a House Divided. That's what we put down for the subtitle. And I want to begin by guessing that you aren't in this for surviving. Am I right? That surviving isn't enough for you. None of us put on our wish list, on our bucket list, you know what I really want to do? Someday I want to survive. It doesn't reach the mark of getting any of our blood flowing. What you want to do is thrive. And so I want to take you to a moment, a recent moment, amid all the house divided, amid all the things that scare us about this election year, a moment on a stage that seemed to bring out full thriving. Maybe some of you saw it. It was about a month ago. It happened at the Grammys. And two artists who had both recorded over time the same song and both had raced up the charts with the same song. Tracy Chapman, who first debuted it in 1988 at a Mandela rally in Wembley Stadium in London, and Luke Combs, who had asked her permission to record it himself, to cover the song in 2023. And on its surface, it seems like a kind of thing that happens at Grammys. Two artists sing together, and it's really nice. Because people at the Grammys can usually sing well, and these two could sing well, and it sounded good, but you didn't even get part of the story from it sounding good, because suddenly in the room at the Grammys, everybody stood up and started singing along, and their eyes started to leak a little bit, and people across the nation were tweeting or posting that they were crying and they couldn't figure out why. I think it will help us enter our story, enter our task tonight, our shared mission tonight, to unpack why those tears came, why hip-hop guys and country guys and pop singers and all kinds of folks at the Grammys suddenly were all in and streaming tears. And it's because it took place in a setting in which the United States are not united, in which we're broken. It took place in a setting in which 50% of us believe that the people who voted for the other person are just a little less intelligent than most people. In which 2/3 of us believe that they're a little bit more immoral than most of us, and 2/3 of us think they're a little more dishonest than most of us, and a full 3/4 of us believe about people who vote on the other side that they're closed-minded. We believe that about each other. We believe it across the aisle. We think we know one another when we haven't even met. And on the stage, in the midst of that, in the midst of 50% of us thinking there's going to be a civil war within some short period of time, in the midst of the numbers that I could spout continuously for a long time about how we're divided, in the midst of all that, up stood a black woman, 59 years old, who's queer and progressive, with a white man who is 39 years old, or 33 years old, and a country singer, and white and straight. And there they are. He has idolized her since he was a kid. He has begged her to do her song because he remembers hearing it from his dad's playing it when he was 5 years old. It became his favorite album, the album on which it was. The song is Fast Car, and there they are singing on the stage a song together about what it is to be able to belong in Americana. Is there a place for me in this place? Was the question of the song, and was the question of each of them at different times in their lives. And they sang it out together, and the mutual regard and the walls that came down were palpable. They fell down like the walls of Jericho, and they fell down because these two people decided to let Grammy put them on the stage together for us. Right? Neither of them named faith as the reason they did it. We don't know their motives exactly, but it didn't seem like they were trying to make more money. It seems like they saw a crack in us and wanted to be part of fixing it. So in that moment, here are people crying all over the world as they watch. Here are people next to one another who would never talk to one another in the Grammys, shouting it out and singing it out and crying together. It was a moment, it was a glimmer of what we might be if we just stop this stuff. So tonight, that's what I want to take a few minutes to think together with you about. And I warn you that in this setting, I am going to enlist you not just as a survivor, not even just as a thriver, right? But as a shalom agent. Because what broke out on that stage was thriving, which in Hebrew is pronounced shalom. Shalom is the word that often gets translated as peace in our translations, but peace is like drinking it through. Maybe. Peace is like, thanks. Peace is like drinking something through a small straw. Shalom is much bigger than the absence of conflict. It's even much bigger than inner peace, than sort of I'm feeling tranquil. Shalom is a full thriving in self and in community with one another. That's shalom. And we saw it on the stage, and I'm just wondering if you and I can connive together tonight to imagine, thrive, shalom, breaking out among Christians at a time when our world needs it most. And the passage, everybody went to their own place. I wept like a baby when I saw them singing and sang along as much as I could remember the lyrics. But I got to say that at the same time as I was weeping with everybody, I'm a Bible geek. So my mind went to Jeremiah 29. Jeremiah 29 is a letter from the prophet Jeremiah to the newly exiled people from Jerusalem and Judea. They've been hauled against their will off to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar's strong army. They're in a place they don't want to be, speaking a language they don't want to learn, with gods they've never heard of, or at least were told to avoid, and a culture they couldn't understand. And a bunch of them had the notion that the best thing we want to do right now is survive. We just want to bunker down, and as long as this lasts, we're just going to get by, and then maybe someday God will take us back to the land. In that context, Jeremiah wrote a letter from Jerusalem, where the palace and the temple, which had been burned to the ground, are still smoldering. He's heard news of their attitude, and he goes the other way. Listen to what he tells them to do. Thus says the Lord of hosts, says this letter. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I've sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease, but seek the welfare the shalom in Hebrew, of the city where I've sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare, in its shalom, you will find your own shalom. Seek the shalom of the city, says Jeremiah. Don't hunker down, don't hide, don't go into a bunkered existence. Don't just survive. Move toward the difference rather than away from it. Because in their thriving, you'll find your thriving. That's the message from Jeremiah. And I've always wondered how the people in exile received it. Easy for you to say, right? Might be one way they could respond. Easy for you to say, Jeremiah, you're back there in Jerusalem where we'd like to be. Sure, it's all wrecked, but it's a lot better than this place. And we know where we can get a good falafel, right? They might have responded that way, or they may have seen that thriving was better than surviving. And they might have moved toward this new world. And you know what? We know that they actually took him up on it. Because for hundreds of years after this letter, after their exile, after some of them came back home to Jerusalem and lived in the promised land, there remained a thriving Jewish community. In fact, we have a Babylonian Talmud now because they stayed and did Judaism and realized God's here too. They moved toward the conflict instead of away. I'm going to enlist you tonight in the project of asking, what would it look like for us to thrive in our divided states of America? What would it look like for us to thrive when we are called to be one church, but we look like a bunch of them, 33,000 denominations, and who's counting, right? So, in that interest, I think it's probably, ironically on the night of the State of the Union, ironically, it's probably our first job to ask, how did we get this way? How did we arrive at this current crisis in which we are on the front porch of civil war, as many people see it? And to get there, I want to give an analysis that I think works. I am convinced that people hate one another because they fear one another. That they fear one another because they don't know one another. That they don't know one another because they don't communicate with one another, and they don't communicate with one another because they are separated. Does that seem like a good analysis of what you see around you in American culture with its echo chambers and its political tribes? I'd like to take credit for that, but I saw a couple of you nodding knowingly. Those words aren't mine. They're words Martin Luther King gave at Coe College in Iowa about racial segregation in 1962. King looked around and saw the same thing that we're seeing, but it was with race primarily for him. It is with tonight, it is for us, this sort of red-blue, conservative, progressive tribalism of our time. And we get to it partly because of the convergence of things that are just kind of bad luck. 1991 December. Can anybody place the big happening of December 1991? Soviet Union falls. Soviet Union falls, and there is great rejoicing. No more evil empire, no more sort of Cold War in the same way, and people are rejoicing. But you know what happens at the same time as the Soviet Union falls is our common enemy also goes away. Now, sociologists tell us that groups can cohere or gather or gel because of a common enemy or a common cause. And we were in the common enemy zone. So what happens when the common enemy goes away? Suddenly we start fighting one another. So the first domino to go is we don't have the evil empire anymore. Where are we going to turn our zeal? Well, we'll start on one another. And that was helped along by another thing that was actually a pretty smart move. And the collateral damage wasn't intended. I'm sure of it. Newt Gingrich led the Gingrich Revolution in 1994. They won back the House for the Republicans, and in that aftermath, as they were taking office in 1995, he counseled his caucus, live where your people live. Go home, live in your district, because you need to listen to them and you need to raise money among them. So go home. Don't stay in Washington and be a Washington insider. Go home and do the good things that a representative does. That sounds like decent advice. But the problem was that these people who had always gone to one another's soccer games, kids' soccer games across the aisle, or to the opera, or to dinner with one another, suddenly were not meeting. Red and blue representatives, and this ended up happening somewhat in the Senate as well, red and blue Congress people were no longer seeing one another except on the field of play, except on the field of battle. And so they didn't have the usual, I just went out to dinner with you the other night, we got drinks, and we talked about X or Y. They were combatants when they came together, and it took a while for them to raise the stakes on that, but we also find that they were separated. Right? They were separated by this new way of being a representative. Right? The third thing that happened in this sweep, along with the fall of the Soviet Union and the sort of unintentional separation of the Washington politicals, was that in the nation, in the culture, our media habits changed. You know, and this gets spoken so often that I won't spend a lot of time on it, but that's the stretch of time during which Rush Limbaugh is late 80s. And then other kind of talk radio folks come from both sides. MSNBC and Fox come out in the late 90s, 96, 97, as partisan news networks. And then in the 2000s, we get social media arising, and a lot of people start to tribalize through social media. So those developments are seemingly unrelated. The wall comes down, Soviet empire is done. The Congress is done differently socially, and this kind of move through the way we get our information happens. It all converges in those years, and it's no accident that the polarization numbers fly up starting then, because all these factors are helping them, right? And so we started to move geographically toward people like us. So those three forces were in play, and you and I, Bill Bishop wrote in the 90s, or in the early 2000s, and then more recently, a Harvard professor and his grad student have put together an amazing article chronicling our migration toward sameness. 98 to 99% of Americans, according to their sort of demographic research, they looked at everyone who's registered to vote, found out where they live, found out how they voted. Don't tell anybody they stole your identity for a while. They found out everything they needed to find out that 98 to 99% of Americans live in what would be categorized as an extremely segregated situation politically. We don't run into people who vote differently than we do. And even in neighborhoods where we are mixed, we put up yard signs for Black Lives Matter or for support the police, or things that announce our tribe so that our neighbors will know this is or isn't a safe house for you. We tribalize by where we move, and then if we can't get away from the other side, we stick symbols up that tell people we aren't you. Right? So these things have produced in us a separateness, a sort of willful separateness that started with some historical accidents, but then gained momentum through the way we do our news. And then you and I find ourselves here, willfully estranged from one another, except when we make big effort not to be. Now, it happens that Jesus didn't like estrangement. He saw that these first century Jews were very bigoted towards Samaritans. And so he told a story about a good Samaritan, and he sat down at a well with a woman who was from Samaria. He knew that the biggest issue of his day was how to respond to Roman rule. And so he hired as one of his 12 a Roman revenue agent who was kind of supporting Roman rule, and a Jewish zealot, Simon the Zealot, who was trying to overthrow Roman rule. Wherever Jesus saw estrangement, he got in the mix and tried to bring it together. And the most telling place that happens is in Matthew 5 and Matthew 18, which are just incredible. There's a scene in Modern Family. If you've watched Modern Family, you know that this is a very dysfunctional but fun family. And there's a scene where they're all getting to a restaurant late, and they're all racing. They're having a race to see who can get to the restaurant first. And so these cars are flying through downtown, and they all arrive at the same time and almost run into each other. It's a comical moment that is really scary for them. In Matthew 5, Jesus says, if you are giving your gift at the altar and there realize that someone has something against you, leave your gift there at the altar, go and be reconciled to that person, and then come back and give your gift. In Matthew chapter 18, he says, if a brother or sister sins against you, go and tell that person that you've been sinned against, and if the person apologizes, then you have won back a brother or sister. So what does this picture? It pictures the offender and the offended running across a field toward one another. This is a romantic comedy moment, you know. They're running across the field, arms stretched out, and they run into each other like Modern Family almost does, right? Or hopefully it wasn't foggy. The picture Jesus paints is we do not sleep on the estrangement. Estrangement is something to be interrupted by the realm of God. And yet here we sit, friends, here we sit in an America that is utterly estranged, in which the stats are very damning. And we all have kind of sunk into this mode where we say, well, maybe we'll hunker down and wait it out. Or maybe we just won't share our differences and we can sneak by. Or other forms of avoidance that keep us separate and making up bigger and bigger stories about one another. So how do we become agents of shalom? Right? We've spent a little too much time on disunion. Let's talk about what union looks like. What would it look like for shalom to break out in the church and in the communities that we occupy? How would we get there? Well, job one, if separation is the problem, then the solution has to be something about going and finding them. The people on the other side, the people we avoid, the people who vote the other way, going and finding them. And I talked to Tim today and got a little read on St. Philip the Deacon, and you all have blue and red speckles all over the place around here. So it's almost too easy for you all. Same is true a little bit down the road at Wayzata Church. There are more of that kind of church in this area than there are in other parts of the country. I think it's the leftover of having survived winters as Scandinavians. I don't know what it is exactly. But you've got more breakfast groups, you've got more bowling leagues, you've got all these things that sociologists are saying are disappearing. You all have still, and I think you've got more viewpoint diverse churches. So it's a little bit ready-made for you, but you know that friend or that family member, or maybe you're not from this church, or Wayzata Church. Maybe you're from a church that puts up signs to indicate which side of the aisle they're on, or that lobbies or is activist on one side or the other, which is a part of the way the realm of God seems to be happening. But the charge remains, find them. Step one, find them. And let me talk about a couple ways that we can do that, because once we find them, we've got all kinds of things we can do, but we tend to avoid them. So how do we initially do that? In a church, it means having enough conversations to make it known where the differences are. And here I want to just call on that word agape. What does agape mean? Love. What kind of love? C.S. Lewis wrote about 4 loves. What does agape love mean relative to how we love? Unconditional love. Unconditional love. So if you and I never talk about our differences, if we never get to that moment in a marriage where you find out that the person doesn't put the toothpaste cap back on the tube or whatever it is, if we never get to the thing that is really hard for us to take, then agape doesn't get any muscles. We're avoiding the things that we would have to have conditions about. We're not bringing them on the table. Now, am I saying that every time at coffee hour, everybody should talk all the time about politics or theology? Tim would shoot me, actually, but not if he's Quaker. No. It doesn't need to dominate existence, but we ought to know that about each other because psychologists, sociologists tell us that whereas religion or race or region or other things have in the past been the primary identifiers for American people, right now the primary identifier, the thing we most associate with our identity, is partisan politics. It's the lead horse. So if we are leaving that out of our life together as churches, we're missing the thing that's causing the downfall that we've been discussing. In order to get at that, we have to actually do the risky business of saying, you voted for her or him? And then asking the next question. We have to find out who them is, who the other is, right? But once we get to the other, and that's not easy work because some of you are from churches that are relatively viewpoint uniform. Some of you are from really blue churches or really red churches. And it's hard to get out of the bubble. How do you do that? Well, one of the things that can work is a church that is shalom-seeking, that is an agent of shalom, can say, all right, we've got a lot of reds in here, but we need to understand the blues. So we're going to have a work project with a blue church, and we're going to build a house together, or we're going to serve at the soup kitchen together. We're going to do something we both would have done anyway, just so that we can learn to understand one another. And it's not high stakes. We're not talking about abortion or immigration, we're just doing something together, and by the by, getting to know each other. And getting to know, by the way, that the other person is actually not unintelligent, not immoral, not dishonest, not closed-minded. And when we break down that distance, when we actually know the person beyond the stereotype we've built, something happens. So job one is to find them, and it takes a little risk. It takes a little risk in a church. It takes a little risk beyond a church. It takes a little risk in your family. It's that odd uncle who comes to the family reunion and, is so out there. And you've never really tried to understand. You've just kind of found the celery bowl or something, right? So finding them is a big deal, and we have to work at it. Agents of shalom find them, just as Israel found their way to the streets of Babylon. Right? But once we get there, what do we do? Well, the most popular vehicle for getting to know another person, getting to attend to them, getting to listen to them, and actually try to understand them more in my work has become what I call Life Swap. Life Swap is something I learned from Narrative 4, which is a storytelling nonprofit. They help people tell stories in a way that helps them understand one another, tell their own stories. And Life Swap is you and I sitting down and just answering two questions. It could be at a potluck, it could be on our own, it could be over coffee, but I find that churches do it best if they, after church on Sunday once a month, they have a life swap. And realize I'm saying life swap. Yeah, it rippled through, I know. That if they do that once a month and trade partners and find their way around, the community's level of trust grows because the two questions are, what's your political orientation? And what in your life, in your biography, do you think made you that way? What is it that led you to believe the things that you believe, do you think? Is it family? Is it a real influence in college? So that we get beyond the difference, the disagreement, to two lives that are different from one another. And when two lives come into play, again, stereotypes break down, but I also begin to trust that this person is actually doing something authentic and not just following the sort of code of their tribe. Or maybe they hold their belief more loosely than I ever would have expected. I find out new things, and suddenly we can see one another at church or at coffee hour or in town, and we're different with one another. And as you make your way through your congregation with this exercise, with this practice, things get better. Committee meetings get better. That's a big deal, right? How many of you love committee meetings? They get better. Things get better if we know each other and have a context for why they are them and we are we. Why the difference? How did this break out? A second version, and this is the second most popular, and it's the one I do most just because it does that thing where we get to the agape moment. Courageous conversations, like the one with 400 people at Wayzata Church on the marriage amendment, bring a controversial topic into play in a room that is intentionally inviting everybody from across the political spectrum or the theological spectrum. I did one once on do you believe in the devil or not? Because this church was having trouble with how do we read the Bible when some of us do and some of us don't. And so they went for 45 minutes on do we believe in the devil and why do we believe it? And it was pretty, I mean, actually, they look back on it as fun. Talked about the devil today. So it could be on a political topic, it could be on a theological topic. The only rule within it is you speak as you would want to be spoken to in manner, not in content. Right? You speak in a manner that you would like to be spoken to, and you listen in a manner that you would like to be heard. Golden rule is the only thing we put in play really as a guideline. And these get very amazingly good. In Westport, Connecticut, I did one of these, and it was on politically correct speech. And in that setting, in the politically correct speech conversation, there was a woman freshly out of Wellesley University who was blue and had come from red, and there's no zeal like a convert's zeal, so she's a blue. And next to her down the row is a guy who started his business on his own and brought his life up from sort of nothing. And she's talking about privilege, and he's hearing accusation, and they get into it. They start kind of popping at one another and shouting a little bit at one another. And I kind of slow things down a little bit, but they got really into a fracas. Well, we made our way through, and afterward, there they were at the coffee table, talking together with 12 people around them. And the whole group is now talking about this, and I got an email separately from each of them saying, thanks for having that conversation, I made a new friend. They went through the hard conflict, even got a little red in the face and spitty. They got through the hard conflict and became friends because they stayed long enough with one another rather than tromping off at the first sign of conflict. They stayed in the room. That's what happens with courageous conversations. And so those allow us to try out our agape muscles, allow us to try out our muscles for listening unconditionally to someone, not because the issue's not important, but because our first goal is to understand one another. Make sense? There are other conversations in which to talk about the issue in a solving way. These are simply dialogue to understand one another. And between the life swap and the courageous conversation, you can get just a lot done. If you do one of those a month or one every other month and alternate them, the place changes. And you've talked about immigration, and you've talked about guns, and you've talked about abortion. Abortion was the hardest one I've ever done. You could cut the air with a knife. It was very thick. It was very deep. And we sat solemnly at the end and just prayed for a while. But there they were loving one another after it. Not because the issue's not important, not because they weren't passionate, but because they stayed together and understood one another more. I called that first scene that we talked about, that Grammy scene, that coming together across difference scene that seemed to be such a shalom moment, such a thrive moment in the life of a divided country. I called it thriving. One of the words that psychologists have come up with is the word glimmer. Have you heard how glimmer is being used lately? You know the word trigger, right? Trigger warnings. People get triggered by hearing this or that. So you put a trigger warning in, say this may be hard to hear. Trigger is what kind of makes us tense up and get anxious, or is a hard thing that we've got trauma and it appeals to that or something, or it triggers that. Glimmer is the word they're using for the opposite. Glimmer is a moment when hope seems to break out. When there's something there that doesn't look like the rest. One of these things is not like the other. One of these things just doesn't belong. It happened on a Grammy stage. It happens in conversations when people hang on to one another, even though they're on different sides. Glimmers are good, and agents of shalom like glimmers. We look for them. We build on them. We find them wherever we can, and we do everything we can to support them. That seems like something's breaking out that looks completely different than the rest of what's going on. I'm going to go over and find out what they're doing. It's almost like a storm chaser. Right? You know these people who chase tornadoes, and it's almost an obsession. Agents of shalom are good storm chasers. We find where God seems to be bringing people together, and we go there, and we watch it and figure out what happened, and we try to make it happen again. Friends, as we kind of gather this down the stretch, looking at the numbers that I started with, the disunion numbers, the 50% say the other side is stupid, 66% say the other side is immoral and dishonest, 75% say it's closed-minded, 50% say we're on the front porch of civil war, and on and on and on. It can become really disheartening, and it can become discouraging in a way that makes us give up. Some of us have just decided to hunker down and make it through whatever happens. But I think God is looking for agents of shalom. And God has done bigger things than this before. 400 years of Israel's slavery in Egypt. Burning bush breaks out, calls Moses, Red Sea opens, manna comes from heaven. 10 commandments begin to guide a whole new people. Right? Jesus dies on a cross. The Messiah dies. And the disciples think all is lost. And then Sunday morning comes and everything is changed. We serve a God who doesn't stop at hard things and is trying to make us into a people who don't stop at hard things. It's risky. It can be even a little dangerous. We find ourselves thinking the thing that person believes is dangerous, I don't think that I should be talking to them. We find ourselves feeling like I can't do this or I won't do this. But the Jesus we follow doesn't like estrangement. And every time we sit back and watch it and just sit by, I think he weeps. Friends, your invitation is in the air. Do you want to become an agent of shalom? Amen.
Thank you, Alan. He's going to rest his voice for a second. Again, I'm going to make a couple of announcements after I'm done. I encourage you to come up and ask whatever questions you have. And again, those of you at home, send your questions to social@spdlc.org. First thing I'll say is it's hard for me to believe, actually, this is already the 4th of 5 events in this season. So I want to tell you that our next and final event for this year's Faith and Life season is a guy you may have heard of, Kevin O'Connell, the coach of the Minnesota Vikings. Maybe we'll have some Packers fans here for that and Bears fans to model a big tent. But that's on April 18th, 7 o'clock. I honestly have no idea what he's going to talk about, so I hope you'll join us for that. If you would like alerts about that event and you're not already subscribed, you can sign up for our email alerts, look for us on social media, and you will be able to follow along for upcoming events. I will tell you too, and I'll say more about this at the next event with Coach O'Connell, we actually have 4 out of our 5 events for next year already scheduled. I will, again, announce at least one of those next time around, but it's going to be an amazing series. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is that Alan's book, A House United, How the Church Can Save the World, is available for purchase here tonight. So see Mo afterwards, and he will be happy to inscribe it for you as well. So I hope you'll pick up a copy of that. Also, at our front desk is St. Philip Deacon's Quarterly Magazine. If you don't have a copy of it, please pick it up. If you're at home, you can find it on our website, spdlc.org. And I mention this because in this quarter's magazine, which just came out a week or 2 ago, there's actually a really lovely interview with Alan, which I would commend to you. So pick that up as you leave. And then the final thing I want to say, as I always do, is just a word of thanks. Again, for more than 2 decades, I've been saying the same thing. We are privileged here at St. Philip Deacon to offer these events as a community service. It is not a budget item of the church, however. They are funded entirely through the gifts of very generous people and local organizations. These are listed in your bulletins or programs tonight. I'll thank just a few of them. I'm not going to name all of the names, although I'm profoundly grateful to all of you, but I'll mention our corporate sponsors, Crossroads Financial Group, Cressa, Ulrich Real Estate Group, Malley Design, Productivity Inc., Rapid Packaging, and Mastercraft Labels, and again, all of the other individuals listed there. I am so grateful to each of those organizations and all those individuals for making it possible for us to bring wonderful speakers like Alan here tonight. So will you join me? I know we have a lot of the folks who support this either here in the house or at home watching. Will you join me in thanking them? And also, as I've been doing now for 2 decades, I want to thank Jeff Elstad, who is our wonderful guitarist, for pre and post music. So thank you, Jeff. All right. I hope a few of you have some questions. I hope you'll be courageous enough to ask them, either at a mic or by sending them in, and I'll invite you back up, Alan, to respond to them. Thank you.
Questions? Yes, can you make your way to a mic? That would help everybody, I think. And we've got, it's a race to a mic. It's a race.
Oh, boy.
Good. You win.
No, go right ahead.
Okay.
So first of all, you spoke way too short. I could be here till 12 o'clock. It was lovely.
Thank you.
So when I looked at your book when I got here, so tell me 2 things of how the church can save the world, because I feel like it's just all going down.
Yeah.
And with the whole, and this is the louder people, which I always say, I'm not that Christian, those loud, icky people that, you know, they're screaming the louder and they get heard the most. And I think, oh my gosh, people think Christians are like that.
Yeah.
So I struggle with that.
So thank you. And two things that I think really matter. One is the early church was highly persecuted. Right? They were persecuted because they didn't believe in the gods of Rome. They were called atheists. They were persecuted because people thought they were cannibals because they were eating the body and blood of Christ, right? So they thought they were cannibals. They thought they were incestuous because they were marrying people they called brother and sister. The outsiders didn't really get what the early Christians were, but they did uniformly respect their virtue and their love for one another. We see in a whole lot of different texts, Tertullian in his Apology, right around 200, kind of thinly veiled reason that he came to Christ. He says in his Apology, see, the outsiders are looking at the Christians and saying, see how they love one another, how they would even die for one another. That testimony, seeing Christians be toward one another in this unconditioned way, was very powerful in the world, so it would be today too. If people, if the kinds of things we're talking about tonight broke out and a church became famous, not for being judgmental, not for having super cool worship services or whatever it is, but famous because I don't know what else they do in there, but these people know how to talk to one another. These people know how to love one another. These people aren't afraid of bringing up big issues with one another, and we need help with that. That would be a big step towards saving the world, right? And a related one is, and this because the world is telling us they need help. I did a courageous conversation in Wellesley, Mass. I did 3 or 4 with that church in Wellesley, Mass, the village church, and they got better at them. Then the town council started to have a hubbub about Columbus Day. Should we do Columbus Day? Should we do Indigenous Peoples Day? And they were about it at fisticuffs with one another. They couldn't talk about it without having the place blow up. And so they threw it out to the community and said, why don't you all talk about this issue and get back to us? And nobody did, except Sarah, the pastor at that church, called me and said, why don't we have a conversation about this? And so I flew back and we had a conversation about Columbus Day. 120 people showed up in this church that probably draws 200 on a Sunday and talked for an hour and 15 minutes. There was racial diversity, there was political diversity, there was theological diversity. And the people who had been on the town council and 2 advocates, one on each side, were sitting in the back. And they approached the pastor afterward and say, you guys have to do more of this. We don't know how. Right? So the world needs help with this, and we aren't yet good at it, but if we get good at it, we can be of service to our communities by helping them learn. We can export it, we can host conversations for the community. I just got to...
If I buy your book, is that a start? And I mean that seriously.
Yeah, so everybody should buy 5 copies for your mother. Actually, I'm pricing it not to make any money. I just want you to have it because it might help. It might help. There's more in the book. The thing is, and I don't want to I want to make sure this gets across. I've gotten 4 calls in the last week and a half from a Chamber of Commerce in Austin, a junior league in Austin, Princeton Seminary, and another kind of nonprofit organization in Austin, all of them saying we're having real trouble with. And for one, it's the Israel-Palestine issue. For the other, it's election season, and we've got people on both sides, right? And they're just at wit's end. Churches need to be good at this. We need to be practicing this because the world's falling apart. We can help. We can actually learn to do a skill that's useful to them. Does that make sense? Yeah, so thank you for your question.
Thank you. I love your mission and read your book and enjoyed it very much. Would love to sit down for 14 hours and just go on and on. Yeah. But for the moments that we have here, I tried to distill into something. You began your book, if I recall correctly, and ended with quotes from Dietrich Bonhoeffer and talked about his role. And I'm wondering what you would say about his response to what he saw as evil. So he did did not just have somebody who disagreed with him.
Right.
He saw evil and felt like it needed to be stood up against. Yeah. And I do feel like I'm interested in that part of your answer, but I'm also more broadly interested in what does that mean for us now, because I do feel like where we're sitting now, we and they think we and they are evil. Yeah. And that's our biggest problem. So thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you. And what's your name?
I'm Debbie.
Debbie?
Debbie, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Debbie. And so I appreciate you bringing up Bonhoeffer because I said 4 times in the course of things, but they were all toss-off lines. Not that these aren't serious issues, because they are. And there are better and worse positions on them. If we look from a moral standpoint, if we just look at the broad canvas, there are some things going on that are dangerous. What has tended to happen, though, is that we get these lenses. It's what you said last. We get these lenses that really magnify the possibility of ill on the other side's policies and shrink ours. I don't know who makes the lenses, but it can magnify some things and shrink other things. And so perspective matters. Now, the card that you play to win the trick, I'm not going to say, the card you play to win the trick is Hitler, right? If Bonhoeffer wouldn't have stood up to Hitler, if others like him wouldn't have stood up to Hitler and said, this is evil, then history would have gone a different way. He wasn't successful in assassinating. I think that would have been worse. I think others would have, right? I don't know that was a great choice. But he was aware of the ills and the extent of the evil being done. The quick comparison to him is a card a lot of people play in American politics. In 1 week this last winter, like earlier in November, in 1 week I had 2 people talk about the Israel-Palestine situation and compare Palestine to Nazi Germany and compare Israel to Nazi Germany. Right? And we go quickly to that. There are hard, bad things happening, but the idea that they're happening on one side is becoming too prevalent. The assumption is becoming too prevalent. So how we navigate loving one another and standing firm against things that are actually harmful and evil is a dicey, high degree of difficulty dive. But I think that's what we're called to right now. Thank you, Debbie. Other questions?
I actually do have a couple.
Do you have some from
I have a couple online, but again, I don't want to keep others from coming up to the mic if you're here. Here's one of the two.
Yeah.
The book was published in 2018, I believe. Is that correct?
Say it again.
The book was published in 2018.
2018, yeah.
So the question is, how have your thoughts or opinions or actions evolved since you wrote your book? And then it says, since the pandemic and 2020 election happened after it was published, have these events redirected you at all?
Yeah. So the pandemic amplified our division and made more of us aware of it because we were about ready to throw down with one another about masks and vaccines. And by the way, I mentioned to Tim earlier today, you need to treat your pastors well. And by the way, your teachers and nurses well. These are people who have served for a lot of years and they are exiting their profession quickly because they've been treated more and more meanly by the people they serve. And that happened a lot during COVID. Service people, whether it's a pastor who's trying to make the best decision she or he can make, or a nurse who's just on the front lines, or a teacher who's trying to decide what books will be read in the class while a nation arbitrates whether books should be banned or not and takes the brunt of that. Those kinds of things, we lose smart, good people, and we've just become meaner. Right? That's one development. The mean quotient has gone up. David Brooks wrote a piece for The Atlantic that kind of is like what is in his new book that says he chronicles how we've gotten meaner, and he traces it to the absence of effective moral formation institutions, the absence of places that are devoting themselves to making people good rather than making them right on the issues. Schools, churches, institutions that used to sort of cultivate virtue have become more and more instruments of political sidedness. And we take a hit on that, and that became more and more clear during COVID. The other piece, Tim, is I just become more and more convinced that separation is the problem. I left this out for time purposes, but I had 1 week in 2019 where I was invited to 2 denominational pastor conferences. And they were both for the big tent, or the big tall steeple churches in those denominations. So I was invited to Tampa to talk to the big church pastors of the United Church of Christ, which is by most accounts the most progressive of the mainline denominations politically. And that I did the first 3 days of the week, and they were great, and they were Jesus-loving, and they were trying to figure out how Jesus would react to the circumstances they were facing in the world. And then Thursday and Friday and Saturday, I was in St. Louis with the big church pastors from the Missouri Synod Lutheran churches, which is not quite as liberal, right? And they were Jesus lovers, and they were trying to get things right. And they talked about, by the way, the left and right within Missouri Synod, which was a great thing for me to learn, right? So you have these 2 groups that are avoiding one another, and my conviction coming away was we just need to get them to dinner together, because they would like one another. They would disagree, but they would like one another. That sort of contact has become more and more important to me. Mingling across lines, in church and out of church, figuring out ways to break down the separation.
Yeah. Okay, oh, okay, yeah, please. Oh, we got a couple, okay, great.
Hello?
Hi, my name is Stan.
Hi, Stan.
Enjoyed your talk and your
Thank you.
conversation. And I learned something here, because I would not have thought of middle ground, mediation, bringing people together as communicating as a strategy. I'm a very political person, and I'm on one side of the spectrum.
Yep.
And so I'm always trying to convince,
Yeah.
advocate, not necessarily mediate. But I kind of wonder about I wonder about the role of the church in being more of an advocate. And 15 years ago, we had a speaker here, Eric, is his name Eric Metaxas? And he talked about his Bonhoeffer book, I think. But he has just written a book, Letter to the American Church. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
I haven't read it yet. I saw it appear, but I haven't read it yet.
And there he, for whatever it's worth, he believes the American church has fallen asleep at the switch relative to what's happening in our culture and our politics today, comparing it to what Bonhoeffer had to do in the 30s and the 40s. And I'm just kind of wondering where you are on the advocacy part of the voice of the church.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Stan. And yeah, thank you for sort of comparing the 2 kinds of conversation, right? The persuasive conversation, in your introductory words, versus the dialogue, which is not built for persuasion as much as it's built for understanding one another. Because John Jenkins, who is the president of Notre Dame, about 10 years ago, I think, wrote a Wall Street Journal piece that was entitled, "Persuasion is the Key to Civility." The idea that I need to persuade someone keeps me from calling them evil and stupid. Because once you've been called evil and stupid, you don't want to listen to the person who just said it. Right? If I come and rail at you and then say, "Won't you join my side?" it's probably not a great strategy. He was in the midst of the sort of the culture wars and the political wars. He was watching incivility arise and saying, if we were trying to persuade instead of just ring the tribal bell, we would behave differently. And that stuck with me on the thing you said first. Advocating persuasively but civilly. But relative to Eric Metaxas' point, relative to the notion that church is called to be an advocate on one side or the other of some issues in culture. Tim and I were talking about this earlier today. I believe that right now, the problem of polarization and mutual hatred is at least as important as the other issues one might advocate on. In fact, I think it's the one we need to solve in order for the other advocacy to matter. And so I believe God is calling churches to this place where viewpoint diversity is a high degree of difficulty dive, but one we're convinced it's our calling. But that doesn't mean that God isn't at the same time calling churches to be advocates on one side or the other. Because not every church is set up to be a viewpoint diverse church. I have a friend in Texas who's a professor who they did not invite me to come. I thought they were going to invite me to come and talk to them about red-blue stuff. She said, we are one of the only places where people who are marginal can be safe. And so we will continue to advocate for them. And it's not a time in our life, it's not a season in this congregation when it's time for us to be come all viewpoints. This is a time when we need to be that. And there are versions of that on the other side of the political spectrum. There are churches that are called to and ought to be called to lobby and be activists on the issue of abortion, say. And the fact that I'm calling some churches to be blue and red and keep the difference in the room like St. Philip does and like Wayzata Church does and like a growing number of churches across the nation are trying to do, doesn't mean that the others aren't being called by God to do a different thing. What I say in churches like that, though, I was in a very blue church in the Northeast a couple years ago, and the problem with being very blue and Christian or very red and Christian is if you start to treat your brothers and sisters who are on the other side badly, then you're violating Jesus. They're brothers and sisters for whom Christ died. And if my advocacy leads to dehumanizing a whole half of the population, then I'm not being Jesus-y. So advocacy has to be done, and this is John Jenkins' point, advocacy has to be done toward persuasion rather than overwhelm, rather than diminishing people on the way to a victory. And that's a calling of churches that need to be advocates, that need to be activists, that they need to keep it in their minds that the people they disagree with and the people they're trying to win the issue over are children of God, created by God and died for by Christ. If we stop treating one another that way, we've gone all wacky relative to Jesus. Does that make sense? Yeah, I appreciate your question.
Did we have another? Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think maybe this will be the last one, and then I'll ask you the final one.
Okay, well, this one may take an hour or so.
I revised my point.
Just the question's going to take an hour? Can I sit?
I'm a guest here tonight, and I'd like to thank Mike and Julie Braun for inviting me. It's a real pleasure.
I'm glad you're here.
Most of your comments tonight, I would say, kind of were aligned with issues around the current political polarization and polarization around social issues. These all have blurry lines between them. I was wanting to ask, and your questions now have answered maybe a bit of, been an answer to this. 3 other areas of polarization that I would just like to hear comments on is the interfaith question.
Right.
You know, what are we called to do as Christians
Yep. In a
within
pluralism.
the interfaith realm?
Yep.
And, you know, on the one hand, we should be respectful. On the other hand, we are called to, you know, I guess, promote the Christian beliefs. Related to that, within the Christian faith, what about the polarization within the denominations and the various faith beliefs, and what can we do with that? And then the third one maybe is a little bit more out of the box. My wife and I are parents to 3 adult daughters, 20 to 30-ish. And I don't know if it's so much a polarization, but we as a church are losing our young people.
Yeah, generationally.
Yeah, and it has roots, I think, in social issues and political issues. But I don't think the church is doing a good job of helping young people navigate through the complexity of modern life. And I don't know, I'm 66. I wonder if there's anybody under the age of 40 here tonight. Way to go! But I think there's, again, it's not so much a polarization as a loss.
Yeah. So all three of the questions are related in that we might not use the word polarization. We might use the word conflict or distance, because interfaith is this wild world where we're in a pluralism of ideas and beliefs. And the interesting thing that I've found, I didn't get your name. David? Gaylor, got it. The interesting thing I've found, Gaylor, is that red-blue dominates that also, because I have friends who are very much active in interfaith circles, and the friends that I'm talking about are progressive, as are the Jewish and Muslim representatives who come together with them. And so it's pretty easy for them to get together. They read the same op-eds, they drink the same lattes, they are more connected than either of them is with their more conservative brothers and sisters in their own tradition. So when I do interfaith, I try to call each of the non-Christian denominations to what I call the Christian denominations to, which is take the risky task of figuring out how to get your left and right to talk to one another, and we can all be a part of the solution here. Now, that's my interfaith niche, right? That's my little part. But how to do interfaith and stay Christian, convincedly Christian, in a sort of interfaith environment. My friend Miroslav Volf, who was on faculty, is still on faculty at Yale, but was my buddy, my barbecuing buddy when I was there. I asked him once, because he has a lot of Muslim friends. He's from Croatia. He has a lot of Muslim friends. And they are intellectuals, they are theologians from Islam. And I say, well, how do you guys manage that? I mean, you're a convinced Christian and they're convinced Muslims. How do you deal with that? He says, they would be insulted if I didn't try to convert them, and I would be insulted if they didn't try to convert me. Isn't that fascinating? And the follow-up line was, if you don't believe it enough for me to want me to have it, you don't believe it enough. Now, that's Miroslav Volf. I'm not saying a total amen to that, but usually what we do in interfaith situations is we try to be nice. And we don't state our full selves. And we don't look at it as a sort of, not clash, but as an interchange of ideas. We try to get to the things we agree on, and we just talk about those, or we take it to a higher power. I think that if we really talk to people from other religions, they would like to go deeper. They would like to come to the places where we differ and learn, rather than trying to paper over those and just sing Imagine, right? Which, by the way, doesn't want to have religion in it, right? So that's my answer on that one, and I don't think it's fair to answer all of them quite. I think that's the one I'm going to stick with.
Yep.
Did you have one more?
This is a reasonably short one, and again, I'm going to ask this question. You can answer it, and then I'm going to walk up there, and I'm going to give you a gift.
Okay.
And then you can all applaud wildly, okay? You got it? All right. So this is, I'm assuming, from a parishioner of yours at Wayzata Community. Alan was the teaching minister at Wayzata Community, and his discussions around the foundational periods of Christianity had a feel of, I was there watching this happen as he taught. So it must be asked, Alan, were you there? Or did it just seem like you were?
I'm old. Not quite that old. Thank you for the compliment, fair listener. I do want to close with a little bit of a flourish. You know, imagine if our worship and our coffee hours and our midweek Bible studies and the things we do as church together were to become the kinds of things that make people weep a little bit because they look and they see Thrive break out. Right? Just imagine if that's what people experienced when they came among us. Do you think the younger generation would come? The early church was compelling in their devotion to one another and devotion to what they believed. And I believe that we can get there again. I believe that with the God who does these kinds of things, we can be marvelous. Not because we are marvels, but because God makes it happen. So imagine us bringing tears to America's eyes, however that would happen. Imagine us evoking Thrive, and you'll get what I think we've been talking about tonight. Thank you for your attention. The applause is supposed to wait.
I just don't want to have to tell you to stop. Although the applause is well earned. So I am here. Thank you for being with us.
It's a delight to be with you.
Thank you all for coming out, whether you're here in person or online. I'm so grateful to you. And we've got a little gift to remember this night, Alan. It's a little piece of granite that says, with thanks to Alan Hilton for bringing faith to life. And thank you so much, my dear friend. Great to be with you. Great to be with you.
Thank you all. Have a good night.